Good afternoon, everyone. Really appreciate everyone taking time out of the day to join us this afternoon. My name is Tim Weber. I'm CEO and co-founder of Diverso Energy, and I'm joined today by Stuart Galloway, Senior Vice President of SOFIAC. Before we kick things off, we'll just do a little bit of an introduction on who we are and our businesses and why we're here today and what we're hoping to achieve. And I think the timing of this webinar is appropriate. Sustainability is top of mind, and I think we're seeing a lot of sustainability in the new build space due to municipal green standards, building codes, and other mandates. But retrofitting has always been a bit of an industry challenge, and it's something that we're trying to solve. We're trying to unlock that through our combined efforts. So a little bit about Diverso. We started about 11 years ago. It's one of three partners. Our focus was exclusively geothermal, and the idea was to unlock some of those barriers to entry, one being that upfront cost, and two, just being the overall complexity of geothermal. So we decided to level the playing field and treat geothermal like any other utility, uh, where we pay for it, we own it, we operate it, just like Enbridge owns natural gas infrastructure, Toronto Hydro owns electrical infrastructure, we own and operate the geothermal infrastructure. Our basically the idea is geothermal simplified and accessible. So Stuart, I'll hand over to you to tell us a little bit about SOFIAC.
Thanks, Tim, and welcome everybody. Great to see such a big, well, not quite see, but almost see such a big turnout. It's hard to see when we're on thumbnails for a webinar. My name is Stuart Galloway, and I'm the EVP for SOFIAC across Canada. And a little bit about SOFIAC and what we do. So our focus is slightly different, which is why working with Diverso is such a great opportunity. But our focus is concentrated mostly on retrofitting existing buildings. And to do that, we work through or under the Canada Infrastructure Bank. And our focus is primarily on greenhouse gas reduction, but obviously to do that in a financially prudent way, because our intention is to actually help clients realize their ambitions, whether that's GHG, energy savings, reducing the bottom line, backlog maintenance, and or all of the above. It's fully turnkey, and that's the key thing. And one of the things that we're going to come to, but one of the aspects that is becoming more and more prevalent is to do it in a holistic portfolio or total building way, which includes obviously aspects that Diverso will touch. So thank you very much, and thanks for coming, and thank you for inviting me, Tim.
Yeah, my pleasure, Stuart.
So I think we've got pretty much everybody in that we're going to get, and I'm sure we'll get stragglers in. So how about I kick off with a question to you then, Tim?
Yeah, sure.
So Diverso traditionally has been in the space of new build and has learned a lot from those new build projects. Now that you're moving across into the world that we know as a SOFIAC, what are you finding as the significant opportunities, potential challenges of the retrofit space? And how does your expertise from Diverso transfer hopefully seamlessly over to this space? What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think, for starters, it's no surprise the new build market has shifted. The condo market is basically non-existent right now, and that was a space that, we participated in for, our first 7, 8, 9 years. Um, Prior to starting Diverso, we were actually an engineering firm, still are. All of our engineering is in-house. Everything we do is in-house. So we have a lot of experience designing systems in institutional, post-secondary, industrial, retail. Our breadth of experience goes far beyond just multi-residential. However, um, you know, over the last decade, there's been more cranes up in the GTA than any other city in the world, and top 6 US cities combined. So there's just so much opportunity in the new build space, and it was a great fit for geothermal because not a lot of technical challenge. The building is designed for geothermal. We can drill in advance of the building going up. We pre-drill underneath the building footprint. So it was the low-hanging fruit. However, a couple of things have changed. One, the multi-res industry has shifted and it's dropped off. So we're just looking for new opportunities. And second, about 2.5 years ago, we were acquired by a large infrastructure fund out of Europe, CBC Diff. So that investment just allowed us to expand into different markets. We've grown our construction team, our design team, and the public sector, as the condo market has dropped, access to capital in the public sector has also dropped, but greenhouse gas reduction targets, ambitions quite often exceed the budget. And we feel like that's where our technical expertise and our business model could really fill in some of those gaps.
And if I can just butt in there a little bit. So public sector, and something I failed to announce, but I was going to bring up at some point in our conversation, is we're about to launch Fund 2. We've had a very successful Fund 1, which was been running since about 2022 across Canada, but we're about to launch a new fund as of January, which will be $1 billion. And you identified, Tim, public sector as such a great opportunity. And that works very closely with us. We're positioning a lot of the public sector projects to come forward. And one of the aspects I would expect is land use or available land for geotherm. We're going to be working inside the building, so we're largely constrained by that. What do you see there as well for availability of projects?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, access to space is a limiting factor. I think in new builds, it's pretty rare where geothermal is not a technical option or there's technical limitations. With retrofitting, there's a couple of things we would identify. One is the existing mechanical system. Does it lend itself to geothermal? So is it a hydronic based system? Is it a central plant? And geothermal, for all intents and purposes, is a bit of a bolt on at that point. Or if it's not, then is there plans to do a deep retrofit and overhaul the mechanical, which at that point you would treat mechanical almost like a new build. It's a clean slate. You can do whatever you want. You design the mechanical to align with geothermal. Then the second, to your point, is space. Uh, we have the luxury of pre-drilling underneath the building footprint for new builds. Obviously, that ship has sailed with retrofitting. So, and that's one of the reasons why we identified post-secondary. A lot of campuses have access to green space. There's parking lots. There is unencumbered land outside the building footprint. And there's different things we can do. We can drill on angles. We're pretty good at shoehorning bore fields into small spaces. Even with new construction, we're doing 40, 50, 60-story towers where between crane pads and foundations, we're not unaccustomed to dealing with limited space and being creative. So those are definitely the two, criteria that we're looking at. And I think, going back to your first question about opportunity, there's investment tax credits are out there. That's a new thing. It's 30%. Unfortunately, the public sector does not have access to that. And I think through how we've reconstructed our business model, what's really important for us is we're off balance sheet, which is a criteria for most public sector entities. They do not want to see a long-term contract like this, an energy as a service contract, beyond their balance sheet as a liability. So we've had to, rejig a few things to make sure that we check that box. And the other is trying to find a mechanism to allow some of those ITCs to flow back to the public sector entities. So not only do they get a geothermal system without the cost, there's the potential of accessing those ITCs as well.
Well, that's fantastic. Because I mean, you mentioned, well, there's about three things just pinged off my brain there. So one is the flow through of ITCs into public sector. Fantastic. If there's a mechanism for creating that, because often they lose out generally on ITCs on other aspects like heat pumps and things. So if there's a way to funnel that through, one, the off-balance sheet treatment. I mean, obviously, I'm going to drop in that SOFIAC, we're never off balance sheet. That, from our world doesn't exist. But what we do is it's unique into the Canadian market that we've structured our investment so that it doesn't hit the debt service cover ratio. So from a public sector that has a moratorium on borrowing limits, we don't affect that. And similarly, if it's private sector, their opportunity cost of capital is they don't have to make that choice. But you did mention about the fitting of your solution that, from a layman's terms, is on the outside of the building. At some point, it has to connect to the inside of the building. So when you're looking at the challenges around that, um, how would you have tackled that in the past versus how now, if you are combining it through us with a retrofit, that makes life easier? And I know this is a leading question, makes life easier for the clients.
Well, and that's a major reason why I originally reached out to you is that was a bit of the missing link. We recognized very quickly as we pivot into this market, it's not really about geothermal. It's about the overall retrofit, and that could include windows, um, you know, a full mechanical system. It could include a new envelope upgrade. It could include all kinds of things. And geothermal is a piece. It's a significant piece, and it's the piece that I think drives whether it's low carbon or not, or emissions free or not. So it's a major piece. And it's kind of the battery or the engine that's driving everything, but it's still a standalone technology. And geothermal on its own isn't really all that useful. It has to be coupled to the overall package. And I think, you know, and this is kind of an answer and a question to you, for you, I'm curious how you in the past, if you had a client who, the ambition was zero carbon or close to, how did you tackle that, without geothermal, or you just sort of cross your fingers that they found a geothermal provider and that was connected properly to your mechanical system, or what did that look like?
Well, actually, yeah. So interesting question, because this is how we've seen the market evolve just in the short term that we've been across Canada. Is we would do things like right sizing the consumption of a building by doing retrofits, and obviously wiping out some of the other issues that clients face of the capital replacement programs and making them more efficient. But it's always, not always, it's largely curtailed to what we can touch within the building. So when we have a client that says, hey, I'm interested in renewables, and I want to be off grid, or hey, you can get me 30 to 50% GHG from inside my building, I have bigger ambitions than that. Um, we would, apart from sticking a few solar panels on a roof, which, is a great idea, but it's never going to achieve those higher ambitions. We would say, well, we recommend that you go and do exploratory work for a geofield, or you go and look at solar, or you go and look at biomass. But we would largely just say that's not within our remit. It's not what we are able to finance. Technically, we could finance it, but it doesn't fit within the model. I mean, the SOFIAC model is that the client should never have to put their hand in their pocket. So we produce savings that pay for the project. And when you look at something that is a geofield, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but they tend to be around 20 to 30-year paybacks, depending on size and demand. That is slightly outside our scope. Our projects tend to be around the 15-year mark, but 15, maybe 18 mark. So it just stretches it to beyond our realm of what we can do and make it value for money for a client. Whereas working with you, and I'll key that up for you to come back at, we can now combine our resources and deliver to the client. And I, funnily enough, said this morning to a different client. Not only can they have their cake, but they can eat it. I mean, why you would go and buy a cake and not actually eat it and just sit there and stare at it, I don't know, but we'll park that one for a minute. But now they can actually do both and really hit those higher achievements.
Yeah, and I think, it all of this is kind of interesting because, you almost have to break it into, put this into different categories or different camps. There's the technology, which, geothermal is not a new technology and we haven't reinvented the wheel. I think what we have done is we've streamlined it. The sophistication is really more in the process. Geothermal is kind of becoming table stakes now on a lot of the multi-residential projects. So it's not a new technology, but how it's tackled, how it's designed, how it's implemented, that is all fairly new. And I think then there's the business model. And the problem I think in the past is you might have an engineer that understands geothermal, but there's no financial sophistication coupled with that. And I think that's what we're trying to bring to the market. And we're trying to add this element of maturity to the technology, where you have the technical sophistication coupled with the financial sophistication. And I think we were always a reasonably financially sophisticated firm, but now that we've partnered with CVC Diff, they're a 100 billion euro infrastructure fund. That's what, they bring this level of corporate sophistication and discipline to us that now we're able to leverage that and couple that to our technology, experience and track record and proof of concept. So it brings the whole package together. And I think that's something that's always been missing in the geothermal space. And quite often in the past, geothermal was treated like a piece of equipment where you put it out to tender, here's the spec, and lowest cost engineer, lowest cost driller, and just kind of cross your fingers that it's integrated properly. And that doesn't work. The integration between the bore field and the mechanical design is a very symbiotic relationship. You can't look at either in isolation. It's almost like if you're an automotive manufacturer, you wouldn't have the engine engineers operating in isolation of the transmission engineers, right? It has to be a unified effort. They're seamless. There might be two different groups, but when you put them together, it doesn't work very well if your car is revving at 5,000 RPM on the 401 because your engine was not matched to the transmission. And that's often what we've seen in the past with geothermal. It's either going to be undersized, it's going to be oversized. So you're either going to pay too much or you're going to get a system that's not going to perform. It's very rare that you get lucky and have a right size system that's perfectly integrated without that collaboration between mechanical and geothermal.
It's funny you should mention that because we have actually had two large clients that have experienced that exact issue. They've got borehole fields that it's almost taboo to even talk about, let alone address, because they just don't deliver what they should do. I mean, one of the aspects I think that Diverso brings to the table here is obviously, 10 plus years of experience. Great. Obviously, financing coming out $100 billion from Europe, even better than that. It makes our $1 billion look quite piddly, really. But bringing that level of investment, but also something you've mentioned to me in the past, vertical integration. The fact that Diverso is the master of its own destiny on around this. You're not reliant on just pulling crews in randomly and hoping they can do their job. Do you want to expand on that as well?
Yeah, and that was certainly by design. Um, when you are building something to own it and you're guaranteeing this success, and especially CVC Diff being an infrastructure fund, one of the things that made it the perfect partnership is they are long-term patient money. And as much as they're very they're risk adverse in the sense that they don't want to invest in something that they can't guarantee is going to work, and their reputation is far too important for anything to fail. So when you look at it through that lens, that I'm not just, installing this piece of equipment and exiting stage left after the warranty is up or after I get my 10% holdback, but instead, it's more like 100% holdback that gets paid out over 30, 40 years, whatever the length of that contract is or the term. So it's a very different mindset now where you need to control all aspects from the design to all aspects of construction, commissioning, the operation of the system, the monitoring, that energy profile. And that's something that I think you know, I'm sure you guys have seen this in the past when you talk to clients who are maybe apprehensive around geothermal because their experiences have been negative. And it may have nothing to do with design or the installation. It could be the fact that it was treated as a piece of equipment and they didn't realize that it was a living, breathing entity where it's really about energy storage. And when the heat's going into the ground during the cooling season, that needs to be extracted during the heating season. If it's not balanced properly, you're going to have excess heat or not enough heat. And over time, that will deteriorate to the point where, um, it just fails. It's kind of like, and the problem is it will lull you into submission or into a false sense of everything is fine because it can get to the point where it's really far off balance, but you still have adequate heating and cooling. Kind of like, you can go 2 years without changing the oil in your car and it still gets you to work every day and you don't really notice the difference until one day it leaves you stranded. And do you blame the car or do you blame internal combustion engines or do you blame the fact that you just didn't change your oil for 3 years? And that's part of the misconception we're trying to educate folks on is do not treat this as a piece of equipment.
I think you make a couple of good points there that if I can just pick up on. So, one, long-term patient capital. Now, we bring, funnily enough, long-term patient capital as well. It's not quite as patient as yours, but it's still extremely patient. So both of our backers are in this for the long run. And that means goals are aligned with client as well. It's not here to make a fast buck, disappear again, like a condo developer. Sorry if any condo developers are on here, but where it's build cheap, sell expensive, and it's not my problem to maintain thereafter, past the warranties. We're here for the long term. We're bringing together, both of us are bringing money to the table that the client then doesn't have to go and find. We are doing it. The slight difference is that from what we do, and I'm not saying what we do is not complicated, but what we do is once it's commissioned, we hand over ownership back to the client. So it's fully non-recourse, no lien, no lease, no holdover title. But arguably, it's also what the client knows they're comfortable to run. We'll provide training and all this lot so they know how to run all the systems we put in. But they also have a say in those systems so that we're not putting some kind of Rolls Royce equipment in there that they have no idea how to look after. Whereas one of the advantages that you're bringing to the table is that you're bringing what is a sophisticated system. You just mentioned about you've got to maintain the field correctly. You've got to keep it balanced, hot, cold, so you can draw and maximize the advantages of that. But because you actually hold on to it for the duration of your contract, the expertise and the risk transfer really sits very strongly on your shoulders. Do you want to
Yeah, and I think,
expand on
well, I
that?
think, that this is where the nuances between the two business models, ultimately, what I think we're both doing very successfully is solving a problem for the client. And in your case, the client wants well-sourced equipment. They want it paid for. They don't have access to immediate capital. So you help them source the right partners, the right mechanical equipment, the right integration, the right solution. You provide them with that capital. Once it's up and running and commissioned, you're not really needed that much anymore, right? Because a chiller is not a black box. There's you know, colleges, universities, municipalities know how to operate a chiller. That's not new to them, but that doesn't mean that they have access to capital, and it doesn't mean they know how to install and find the right trade partners and collaborate. And I think in this case, because we also have that relationship with us, there's that geothermal integration. So they're kind of getting this turnkey package, both solving a short-term problem, and in our case, a short-term and a long-term. And I don't think there's any gaps in that. Like between the two business models, the two approaches to technology, and the two entities, it really is a true, this sounds cliche, but it is a true turnkey package solution that I don't think there's any gaps. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do so that, remove the excuses to say, I can't afford to decarbonize my building, or it's too complicated. I'm not sure what equipment to choose. We've essentially eliminated those excuses, or not excuses, reasons why you wouldn't necessarily be able to do it.
Yeah, I think you know, working with clients, sometimes it's perceived as it's in the too hard box. So I don't want to stick my head above the parapet. I don't need to do change because somebody's going to rain miraculously some money down from heaven when something breaks. But that's not really looking to the future, and it's not really hitting what we should be morally hitting from a GHG, from actually, if we took public sector, from preserving public sector taxpayer dollars and making the best use of it. But apart from anything, it's we're trying to make it, I think, collectively easier so they can navigate that too hard box that previously they've been concerned about. It makes it safe to put their head above the parapet.
Well, and I think to expense, it's interesting for me. I've had public sector RFPs come across my desk for the past 10 years, and I've been in the industry now over 20 years. And I'll often kind of laugh when I'll look at them, and it's not something that we normally have responded to. And even now we will respond to an RFP, but it's really about creating relationships with the client and trying the best we can within the limitations of the, you know, procurement requirements that exist in the public sector, obviously different than private. However, the outcome's the same, the risks are the same, the need to integrate is the same. But what I've often seen with geothermal, I'll see these RFPs and think, oh man, well, that's great. You're going out to get the lowest price on by far the most expensive geothermal system I've ever seen. And I think it's a shame because we could do this far more effectively. It'd be a far better outcome and probably for half the price. Because what happens is, I think when you kind of compartmentalize different pieces, those involved to de-risk it, and it makes sense. Well, if I'm going to do this, I'm not really certain about how geothermal works. I'm not a geothermal expert, but I'm taking on that risk. It's belts and suspenders, and in some cases, they're gold-plated belts and suspenders. And I get that. That's an appropriate response when someone tasks you with designing and going to market for a technology that you don't have 20 years of experience. This isn't what you necessarily do. So uncertainty breeds, um, you know, excess. You need that safety net. Nobody wants to get sued. Nobody wants to have somebody's finger pointed at them. And I think by the two of us working together, both of us could do this individually and it would be fine. The nice thing now is there's no, well, the mechanical contractor did this, or you saying, well, the geothermal's not providing enough energy because we're involved early and we're collaborating on that process together. There's a lot of sign off and a lot of kind of milestones throughout the project where by the time you get to operation, everyone's in agreement because if they weren't, that would have been flagged much earlier and fleshed out. So the client ends up with not only a far better system, but I would argue in most cases a much lower cost streamlined um, system, far more bang for their buck. In this case, the buck is, although it may be zero, we still need to get those monthly payments as low as possible. The business model doesn't work, just because we're paying for it and turning it into an annuity. We need to get that annual or that monthly payment as low as possible. Because we're not interested in doing projects where our payments are at least close to offset by savings. We want that cost neutrality to happen operationally, even though it might be zero up front. Otherwise, it's a liability.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, similar to our model, I mean, we actually provide a positive cash flow from day one back into the client to help them with other resource issues that they might have, um, which is, interesting when you combine the two. I think what one of the important things that you're saying here, and I think it needs emphasizing as well, is if a client were to do a retrofit, whether they use SOFIAC or whether they go and do an ESCO model or whatever they might do, but they do a retrofit. And then separately, they say, hey, now we've done our retrofit or we're further along on our retrofit. Now we're going to go and look at a renewable and we'll look at geofield. And somehow the client now is stuck in the middle of those two technologies. And the risk, and this is, the couple of big projects that we came across that they had already before we came across, so it had nothing to do with us or Diverso, is they had a geofield that just was not working and they didn't know what to do with it. Or they probably had some ideas what to do with it, but involved a very large bomb. But the idea is by us coming together, working for a total solution, and it could be a total solution that covers more than just one building. It could be portfolio. If you've got a campus, like you're a university or something like that, higher ed, you've got ideal opportunity to really make the most of a combined project and transfer that risk of integration and things going wrong sits between us and you. Makes life so much easier to say yes.
Well, I think, to me, the biggest misconception is that I mentioned it earlier that geothermal is a piece of equipment. And if you think of it as equipment, you'll treat it like equipment, you'll procure it like equipment, and you'll realize afterwards, oh, it's not a piece of equipment. It's actually infrastructure. And if you think of it as infrastructure, nobody intends to buy their own natural gas infrastructure. They wouldn't bring pipes to their building and figure out how to, you know, manage that and guarantee they always have access to energy. Very few people want to own their own electrical infrastructure, or really, you know, so when you think of it as for what it is, and it's energy infrastructure, not just plastic pipes buried in the ground, an extension of your mechanical or extension of your foundation or your building, because your mechanical system doesn't change. You procure it, you look at a spec sheet, it has an output of X and has a voltage requirement of Y, and this is what it'll deliver. And as long as I hire someone to maintain it once a year, which there's dozens of companies that can do that, it'll operate the same on year 20 as year one. A bore field, it doesn't work that way. You don't, change filters and lubricate bearings and, change belts. It's a living, breathing entity. And we've seen that in systems where, whether it's condo corps or other buildings where maybe there's a receiver involved and they have a geothermal field and they've come to us and, hey, are you interested in buying this? And 9 out of 10 times when it's 7 or 8 years old, we'll see it's 105, 110 degrees. And there's nothing wrong with the system the way it was designed. It was just left unattended, and every year it got hotter because the chance, if you think of it again as a thermal battery where heat's going in and heat is coming out, the ground can make up for a little bit of an imbalance, but not much. So not only are very few buildings perfectly balanced, it's very rare that buildings operate the way they were commissioned. And no one mismanages a building on purpose, but when you have natural gas and electricity and there's an unlimited amount, you can mismanage your building with no real penalty other than high or inefficiency and higher energy bills. But with geothermal, it becomes a bit of a tattletale and you don't have the luxury of infinite energy. So now what we do is we kind of, unfortunately for the client, fortunately and unfortunately, is we sort of force them to operate the building the way it was designed and to operate it efficiently. Now, I mean, it's not that it's a finely tuned piano by any means, but it needs to operate the way it was designed. And if it doesn't, it's not an immediate problem, but we can see this trending happening within our bore field. And we'll go back to the building owner and say, hey, what did you change? What are you doing? It's like, oh, I turned my makeup air way up, or I decided to use the backup boiler. Whatever that change was, they bring it back to the way it was designed, and we carry on. But if nobody's watching that bore field, there's no way of knowing that there's this long, slow decline in the performance until 6, 7 years later, it's too late. And I think that's more evident. It's more evident in the public sector. And I've seen, especially schools, there was a period about, I don't know, it was maybe 15 years ago, there was a lot of money being handed out to high schools or schools in Ontario. And a lot of geothermal systems went in. And unfortunately, 5, 10, 12, 13 years later, a lot of them were decommissioned and gas boilers were put back in. So not only was there a lot of taxpayer dollars spent on those systems, there's taxpayer dollars spent shutting them down and replacing it with gas boilers just to end up back to where you could have started with just a conventional gas system. And And I think many of those folks have probably blamed the technology rather than blaming, I would argue it's the approach. Call it the procurement approach, just the lack of understanding of what geothermal is, or maybe it was just too much free money on the table and it didn't matter. And either way, it created a lot of heartburn for the geothermal industry, trying to unwind, the reputation damage that went with systems that weren't designed properly. I actually went to one, this was about 6 years ago, and they were having issues. And we got there and they said it only really works properly after a heavy rainfall, which is crazy. And I 20 years, I've never seen that before. I know why that's happening, but that's clearly a system that's not effective and you can't rely on if it only works after a heavy rainfall.
It's quite funny, that one. But couple of things there I just want to pick up on. So one, you just briefly touched on it, and the world of higher ed or education generally, and some of the incentive money that came out that sort of facilitated a lot of those early projects, and perhaps didn't, like we tend to do anyway with free money, we tend to be a little bit less thoughtful, a little bit more liberal in how we actually implement a project if somebody else is paying for it and money is raining from heaven. But I think, well, you mentioned ITCs and a way of bringing ITCs to a public sector, which is great. And similarly, from a SOFIAC point of view, any free money, nobody beats free money, let's face it. So if we have money that is coming in from an incentives point of view, whatever that might be, from whatever source, that is stackable to both our technologies, or both our project solutions, should we say. So it's not a case of, oh, if I get this, I can't do this. It's actually, no, it just makes your project even better, more the economics work even better. We can achieve higher GHG reduction, in our case from a retrofit, because GHG doesn't always mean energy savings. So it does mean that we can go after some of those slightly longer term if we get free money. When we're doing a project in Quebec, and I know probably most of the audience here is Ontario, but when we do them in Quebec, nearly 50% of the project is paid for by the government. So although our investment is gross, our net is actually 50% of the investment of the total capex of the project. So that really makes the economics of a project work. And it means, from a portfolio point of view, we go from like 50% GHG up to, say, 60% GHG without the client putting their hand in their pocket. I had another, measurement and verification. So you're talking about sort of the internal and potentially some of the pitfalls that have happened in the past with other geotherm providers or clients that haven't perhaps looked after, and how you can very quickly identify if something isn't balanced within the building as well. And I think I'm going to put a plug in here, is one of the things from a SOFIAC point of view, we're there for the long term, 15 years. We will take on an independent third party to do measurement and verification of the actual energy savings on a monthly basis throughout the duration of that contract. Where this couples with the Diverso side, though, is, again, very, very quickly, we're going to identify where pieces of equipment within a building aren't performing to the right standard, because the onus of proof is on us, but also the risk is on us, because if it's not performing, we're not getting paid. So for the same reason that we will also be looking for things that aren't quite performing, and that will hedge off against some of the risk of something not performing and flagging up on your side with the geofield. So we're actually almost there double de-risking that issue. So where things have had a pitfall in the past, now actually, again, the beauty of combining these solutions means that it actually makes sense for a client and
Well,
risk.
yeah, I think the key word is accountability. And, you know, the problem is whatever entity pays for the system is the entity that's responsible for it. So if you're the building owner, or if you're the public sector, private sector entity, and you pay for the geothermal, that's fine. Just need to recognize you are now taking on the responsibility of being the owner of that geothermal system. What we're trying to do is it's not just about offloading the cost. That's an immediate benefit, obviously, if you're a college or a university and you've got aggressive decarbonization mandates and the pressure's on and your budget, of course your ambition always exceeds budget, and it's nice to offload that cost. And that's fine, and I get why that would be a benefit, but I think the bigger benefit is also just offloading the responsibility. And I use the word responsibility. I think in the private sector, when we talk about pension funds, for them, it's about risk. Like they assess everything by risk. So we work with a lot of pension funds. They love our business model um, because they're risk adverse. In the public sector, I think it's just as much about responsibility. If you're the facilities manager at, U of T or York or any school, and somebody makes a decision to go low carbon and you now inherit this technology that you don't know anything about, but it's your responsibility to keep the plant running, it's pretty nice if you can, you know, I'll take care of the chillers. That's a space I know well, but I'd like to offload the responsibility of this geothermal bore field, which I have no understanding of, no training. It's complicated, it's weird, and I have to monitor it. I'm not really sure what that trending even means. What am I looking for? Because it's a very nuanced technology. And I think it's that offloading. So now you've got the entity who's responsible for it is also the entity who has money buried in the ground, right? It's an old saying, got skin in the game, right? So I think that's the peace of mind for the client is knowing the entity who owns it, A, has a ton of experience, they have the knowledge, they also have we're financially invested, so we're intrinsically motivated to make sure that our system works, but also the mechanical. We're often coming into buildings and fixing mechanical systems or making suggestions beyond our contractual obligation, because if the mechanical is not working, we're going to have a problem anyway. So rather than just tapping the sign or pointing to the contract and saying, well, it's not our fault, it's a lot easier for us to get out in front of that and work with the client to make sure that, you know, things are operating the way they're supposed to be, rather than us just being responsible. We don't have the luxury of only being responsible for our bore field. We get dragged into the building stuff as well, which is totally fine. It's in our best interest to get out in front of that.
Well, that makes sense. I mean, same with us. I mean, reputation risk is sometimes extends beyond contractual risk. Is when mud is thrown, it sticks to everybody. So it's again back to the cooperation point. So when we're developing out a project that has a right sizing of the building, the retrofit of the building, and we're combining that with Diverso solution around the geotherm, we're going to be sat there in the same room at the same time saying, you're going to be going, hey, I need this to be able to connect up. And we're going, great, we need this to travel right throughout the building and keep things warm or cold as the need may arise. And presumably sort of the integration of those technologies is a little bit more than just here's a pipe and a valve. I mean, you can tell I'm not technical. A pipe and a valve to make that work. So that's where, we'll bring in our partners that we have, and they're the major contractors that you see across Canada. So we'll bring our partners that actually understand that technical and build those requirements into our funded solution.
Mhm. Well, and this is where in the public sector it's trickier because in the private sector it's simple. We go to a client, we have a relationship, and that's it. And we have an understanding. We work with their team, and we move forward. There's You can't sole source in most cases in the public sector. At least that's a lesson that I'm learning very quickly. And however, it doesn't change the fact that is still in need for that early integration. So we're trying to navigate, within the rules of engagement that have been laid out in front of us, but still end up in that same process of how do we get involved early enough to keep this on the track. So this design and the RFP doesn't end up, upside down in the ditch like we've seen so many times in the past. How do we make sure this is still a well-designed, well-priced, cost-effective system that's going to deliver? And that's where we're trying to build relationships with these clients early, just so if there is a mechanical engineer involved, if there's a SOFIAC involved, then it makes it even easier because now those engineers can work together, there's still going to be an RFP, but at least that RFP will represent something that actually makes sense. If we're fortunate enough to also be awarded that RFP, that's even easier now because we're responding to something that we kind of helped create. So now we still need to be price effective and everything else. But at least the client now still is allowed to go out through the RFP process, but they're going out with an RFP that represents a well-designed, well-integrated, well-thought-out system that's reflective of their long-term and short-term objectives.
And that's good actually. You've mentioned the dreaded P word a couple of times now, and I mean, whilst we do have private sector clients also like to do procurement, but it is obviously heavily regulated and required in a public sector sense. I mean, that's probably where the SOFIAC model comes to bear and is very helpful. I mean, we don't respond to RFPs mainly because of the way the solution works for SOFIAC. There is no other solution in Canada, which is why it's been so successful. There's no other solution in Canada that is the same. There's people sort of try nuance and just, human behavior. We will say, well, there's some similarities to an ESCO. Well, yes, but not really. Well, similarities to an energy service. Yeah, but not really. Is it a PPP? No. This is actually something that is unique. So what that does give us, because it's sort of investment based project, it is unique in Canada. It means that, and it's not 100% always, but we tend not to go for those projects that we don't get sole sourced. So we do work sole source with the clients, public sector clients. And the way, forget about how we structure it, that's a longer conversation and a different day. But what that does mean is we will then, with the client, procure the project. So the project, and we have all our own tender documents to do that, and they're obviously involved in that process as a client. But it means we do an outcome-based style procurement. And that can be as integrated and as expanded as the client, the public sector client needs or wants. But it really does mean that they're now getting the optimal solution, not the cheapest solution necessarily. Now, optimal does mean long-term value for money. So again, not the cheapest to go and dig a few holes or put a chiller in and who's supplying the boiler price. It's actually what is the full long-term value of that project and the life cycle cost of that project, because that's where we want to be. That's where we want to be for optimal procurement. And I know, a lot of public sector are getting there now, and moved away from the lowest cost bid. So that's where we can come in, and not that we're going to hand a project to any of the partners, but they have to actually be fully transparent. But it does give opportunity to reputable firms to actually put a proper solution rather than, and I'm not saying Diverso would, I'm going to put a cheap solution and then try and build the cost up later, and say, well, you didn't ask me for this. It's actually outcome based on whether it's GHG reduction, energy savings, whatever that might be.
Well, and I think there's nothing wrong with a competitive process. I have no
Mm.
objections to a competitive process. In fact, I welcome that. I think the challenge in the past with kind of more of a conventional procurement requirements or is that you've got consultants who might be nervous. So as a result of that, they are going to add additional belts and suspenders. And then on top of that, you might have mismanaged expectations that aren't realistic rolled into it. And then it's this compounding effect where you've got a system that's doubled in size, plus it has, and all of a sudden, oh, we thought this geothermal was going to be $2.5 million, and now it's 6 or 7. And it might not even be any better. It might even be worse. That's the problem because expectations haven't been managed. So I think, we welcome the competitive process, but in the case of our business model, there really is nowhere to hide because that monthly payment, as I mentioned earlier, it has to be low. We're just kicking that can down the road and we're going to have buyer's remorse or we have to be able to defend that charge. But at the same time, we have to provide a system that works 100% or we don't get paid. So we've got this unique combination of performance accountability and price effectiveness. We can't pick and choose. Where in most cases, it's the old saying, do you want it cheap? Do you want it, fast? Do you want it whatever, right? And
Quality.
we have to be all because we have no choice. We have an ownership team whose reputation is, they own airports and, you know, telecom companies and large scale infrastructure. They will not allow, they're too big to fail. It sounds cliche, but it's true. They will not allow the system to fail. So that's our performance requirement. But for the client, we know that monthly payment needs to be within a certain threshold so that we can't play any games because we are kind of the client ourselves. We're not selling anything. We're providing the infrastructure and they're connecting to it, but we're the ones who are responsible for the outcome, which means we have to manage those expectations. Are you sure you want zero carbon? Are you sure you want to offload your domestic hot water? Like, are you sure that makes sense? We can do that. However, for half the price, I can get you 90% of that. Does that not maybe make more sense? We can have those intelligent conversations up front about diminishing returns and what's the sweet spot and how do we get a system that checks your sustainability boxes, but you also get something that's good value. And that's where I think there's been a disconnect. There's a lot of, you know, and I might split the room a little bit on this one, but I think there's a lot of conversations around sustainability, but not always around what's the best approach to sustainability or trying to cut the gas line or chase that last mile. Whereas in many cases, we can get clients to, 70% carbon reduction without breaking a sweat. But that last little bit is now you're blowing your brains out and there's heat pumps on top of heat pumps and air source combined with the geothermal. And it's not a technology limitation, it's a financial limitation. And then you end up with a system that's also incredibly complicated. So what's that sweet spot? And the client might want full zero carbon, net zero, and that's fine. We can deliver that. But it's having that conversation up front around, are you sure? And here are the consequences. Here's the challenges. Here's what you're signing up for. So now they can make an informed decision because we have that experience. And we have nowhere to hide. We're investing. We're like an equity investor in this project. So why would we mislead anyone? Because we're only hurting ourselves because we're not walking away. We're here for 30 years. So we're kind of, like it's like bringing in a partner rather than a typical procurement relationship or a supplier. We're more like a partner.
And it's good that you mentioned that because obviously I know if you read the press that the world is moving away from the conversation of GHG reduction and it's now into resilience and but it's the same, what is it, a rose by any other name still smells as sweet, but it is still there is still a big carbon play here. I mean, we know there are going to be pressures still coming. Whilst carbon tax was removed from a lot of the provinces, there are still Carney is talking about sort of implementing something different, but it is just the right thing to do. But I mean, you mentioned that some of your projects are like 70% reduction, and where our portfolio, so I will say portfolio because it does depend on province and what clients actually want in their buildings, is sitting at above 50%. And when you think about it, both of those have been achieved without the client actually at that point adding any money to the pot. But pretty much everybody has these carbon goals. Somebody lofty on high says, reduce to zero by 2050, to 2040, 2045, whatever that might be. But we have no roadmap to get there.
Right.
And I think by us coming in together, we're going to severely dent that intended roadmap. But the difference is we're not going to do it over the next 10, 15 years build out. We're actually going to do that within 2 years and actually say, right, we've just reduced your overall portfolio by X, whatever that might be, 50, 60, 70% GHG reduction. And we've done it for free. But I mean, I say free, but we've done it without you having to pay for anything.
Yeah, no capital outlay.
No capital outlay.
And I think it's about competing. We meet with a lot of clients, and they have lofty ambitions, and then the realities of the budgeting comes in and say, well, I would love to do that, but I've got money allocated for academia for this expansion. It's just there's too, it's like a household, right? There's lots of things you'd love to do. We want to go to Italy next month, but we have to pay for, you know,
Yeah,
whatever, right?
food.
And the dentist bill, and I think in our case, we allow the clients to at least start, between putting in the geothermal and doing a fairly major mechanical retrofit, the heavy lifting is done. You might not get to zero carbon, but you've taken a big chunk and now you can expand off of that. So over time, as more capital is freed up, or, you can take that from 70 to 100 over time because you've got that infrastructure in place, you've got that big lift, and now it's within striking distance, but you have to start somewhere. But if you start too small, you haven't addressed that big lift. And I think by putting in geothermal coupled with a updated mechanical equipment, heat recovery chiller that does heating and cooling, you know, you are within striking distance, and it can be done.
Yeah, I think it was Efficiency Canada that first coined this a number of years back, and it was something like 70. It might have been TAF actually, so I apologize if I've got the person wrong, but said something like 70% of the buildings that we have today are still going to be here in 2050. So we have to be doing something and substantial within those buildings to even look close at getting those carbon reduction targets hit. But regardless of whether you believe in carbon reduction, um, or whether you even believe morally that it's the right thing to do, um, it is going to cost. Having high emission buildings, not reducing our carbon footprint is actually going to hit the bottom line for everybody, for companies. I mean, carbon tax got repealed. Who knows what's going to happen and when, but something probably will happen. Somebody's going to be looking back at this again and they're going to be saying, okay, it's the right thing to do. And they're going to be applying penalties and sticks, maybe some carrots to go with it. But we've had a lot of carrots in the past. Now the sticks are going to start coming out as well.
Yeah,
So it's
100%. And I
getting
think
ahead of
that's
that
what
game.
the future proofing of buildings, and a lot of our clients, especially the institutional pension funds, REITs, for them, it's not even about energy savings. They're concerned about the policy that hasn't hit yet. That's what keeps them up at night, and they want to future proof their buildings to make sure that you know, the building they're building now is reflective of the building of the future, and that's going to impact asset valuation. It's going to impact all kinds of things. So there's a lot more to this than just emissions reduction, but at the core, that's really, what is it? That's what it is. What's driving that is different for every entity, and that's fine. We're not here to pick and choose the motivation. We're here to make sure that we address the outcome and make sure that the client's expectations are not only delivered on, but I'd say just as important, managed up front. Are you sure you know what you're asking for? And, educate them so they can make informed decisions and then take on that accountability.
Gotcha.
So
Now,
I think we're at the
I
top
know
of the
we're up on
hour.
time.
Yeah,
Sorry?
that's okay. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I can see we're virtually up on time. And fortunately or unfortunately, we don't have any questions
Oh, I
specifically
think it's
sitting in here.
because we did such a good job of explaining. I
Well,
think.
that's why I say fortunately, because maybe we did a good job, and unfortunately, or rather fortunately, because also it meant there were no real difficult ones. But just quickly, what two key things would you like to leave the audience with around what we've just talked about today? What would be two takeaways we'd ask?
Well, for me, it would be that early integration, getting an entity at the table early during the process rather than geothermal being an afterthought or a bolt-on. I've seen it too many times. The cost difference, the outcome, the effectiveness is massive. So I think early conversations, bringing a geothermal designer with mechanical to integrate the two effectively early. And then also, I think the takeaway is around misconceptions around the performance and old systems that have failed. I don't think, and I will never say to someone that information is wrong because it's not inaccurate, it's not wrong, it's just outdated. The technology, the industry, the players, the market has evolved significantly. CBC Diff investing in geothermal in Ontario and Diverso, they don't make bad decisions. This is a company who that's what they do for a living. They have analysts, they look at the players, the market, and the opportunity. And they're the first large player to invest in geothermal in Ontario. So I think that speaks to the maturity of the market. It speaks to the certainty in the technology if applied properly. So I think a lot of that information is just outdated.
I like that.
How about yourself? What would be your takeaway?
So a couple from mine is, I guess, don't be self-limiting on what is the art of the possible. And I use another one. So I said art of the possible. The other one is paralysis by analysis.
Yeah.
Is don't keep spinning your wheels internally. It costs nothing to have a conversation. There's no obligation, but at least make informed decisions or have some information to make a decision around. It might not be the right solution, but at least, Tim or myself, we could probably point you in a direction if it doesn't work for us. And then the other one I think is I'd echo your point, take it in a slightly different direction about the integration. Is it's not a building by building or asset by asset within the building solution. Really, if we're going to get to somewhere properly, we need to look at integration of an entire building and then preferably portfolio of buildings. Because if we can achieve 70% GHG across a portfolio of buildings, wow, think about the liability reduction, the resilience reduction, increase. There's so much more that can be done when you start to look at economies of scale. And both companies, because of the backing that we have, is capable of doing things at scale. We're not interested in doing a lighting project. You're not interested in sort of drilling a few holes and saying, hope you like it. I'll come back in 30 years and see if you're still going. We want to be partners. We want to do proper projects. So that would be mine.
Well, that's great. Thank you. And thank you, Stuart, for joining us today. Thank you, everyone who tuned in. We hopefully you got something out of this, and feel free to reach out to either of us if you have any questions. And I echo Stuart's point. We're more than happy to have a conversation, and I'll be the first one to tell you whether I think geothermal makes sense or not, because I'm not interested in wasting your time any more than ours, and we have the experience to identify a good opportunity versus something that might be a little more challenging. So, thank you, everyone.
Brilliant.
Have a
Thank you, everybody.
See you today.
Take care.
Appreciate it.
Yes, bye.